All right, welcome to Module 5. This is going to go over the Unix/Linux operating system. This one's definitely a lot easier to digest, and I would say from a career standpoint, you can definitely go the Windows administrator route, or you can go the Linux admin route. Generally, it's kind of odd for our career. We always focus on learning and mastering the Windows operating system, as that's more commonly used for endpoints and forensic artifacts. It's everyone knows how to do Windows forensics, and then we all struggle with Linux, or we outsource to a strong Linux team. But as far as the command line goes and running commands for any kind of tool in the back end or standing something up, it's all going to run on a Linux server. So we learn and master the Linux command line, but master the Windows operating system. I don't know. That's just my experience or 2 cents. Everyone knows Windows very well, and then Linux is like, what's this? But I know all the commands. So choose your route. Good to know. High level of both. Module 4 and 5 are definitely going to cover that. The Linux module here, we already did an intro to Nix and covered some of the important concepts there. So here we'll do a bit deeper of a dive into the Linux operating system, how it functions, how the architect is kind of set up, commands to know. Definitely put a good number of commands into one compiled slide for you. That'll be 99% of your career that you need to know with Linux commands. We'll go into section 2. We'll cover PIDs, variables, and the file system. And then section 3 is just miscellaneous stuff that I think you should know as it relates to Linux. Didn't know a common category to put them all in, so they ended up in miscellaneous. We can go ahead and start with section 1 for the design and commands. So, key terminology here. We have a shell that is the Linux command line interface. There's 2 main ways to operate with the Linux operating system, as we've discussed. That would be the GUI or the CLI, front end or back end. In Linux, the back end CLI, it's called the shell. In Windows, we kind of refer to it as command prompt or PowerShell. A process, this is a running program, so it's a program that's running in execution. A daemon, kind of important to know for Linux, it's just a program that's going to run in the background for its execution. Lightweight is a terminology you should be familiar with, so we have something called a lightweight process. This is kind of like a thread in Windows, but it shares most of its address space with the resource and resources with another process, so it's not really taking up address space and kind of being heavy or needing space allocated to it, so we kind of refer to it as lightweight. Linux operating system is very lightweight compared to Windows. Library functions, this is a wrapper function for a system call of a Linux kernel, so in your C library, and they can be static or dynamic. And then the user mode versus the kernel mode, definitely important for Linux terminology, as we get into the architecture slide, you need to understand what section of the Linux architecture you're working in and how system calls are made and how it's kind of split up to protect the inner ring levels that we talked about as well, ring 3 to ring 0, where the kernel resides. All of it's going to kind of come together in this module. So, the architecture diagram. This is important to know, just a good picture here, grab from PacketPub. Thank you so much for this. It's an overview of the Linux operating system, and it kind of shows the key areas here. 1 being user mode, 2 being kernel mode. So we have our user space here with all of our compilers and our processes that are running and executing. They go down to our system libraries and our kernel space here with the kernel and the kernel modules. And then it's kind of interfacing and working with the hardware for our CPU and RAM utilization. An important note here is the system call. We've covered this, but we can touch on it at a high level again here. It's just converting a process running in user mode to something that's running in the more protected mode in the kernel space. So if a user wants to execute something, remember we said the kernel is kind of like the police force and the heart of the operating system, it will either approve or deny requests made from a user or processes that are running to say, yes, we can approve this at the heart of the operating system level, or no, we're going to deny it. So in order to make those requests, we have to perform system calls. Would be beneficial to kind of cover at a high level the Linux boot process. Definitely not as bad as Windows. And if you remember this saying, Big Mike got killed in Russia, this breaks out for the start of the acronyms here. And it kind of makes it easier to remember. Do you need to memorize this? No, but it's definitely good general knowledge to have. And if you can kind of compare in your head the Linux boot process for their legacy and modern boot to Linux boot, that's all we're really trying to demonstrate here. So B is our BIOS. We've covered that in the Windows operating system. BIOS is going to execute the master boot record, which is then going to execute the Grand Unified Bootloader, and then the grub will execute the kernel. It's the heart of our operating system. The kernel will start init. Init might be a new term here. I would definitely be familiar with what init is and that it's going to have the PID of 1. We're going to cover process IDs in a second, but init is the parent process for pretty much everything on the system. It's going to be responsible for starting and stopping pretty much any other process that goes off of it, a majority of them that are essential for the boot process. It's going to start system and services, daemons, which are those processes that run in the background, various initialization tasks during the boot process. And obviously it's started by the kernel, and it's responsible for launching all other processes that are needed to run on the system. So if you ever do a ps tech elf on your Linux shell, it's going to be at the top. The PID of 1 is going to be reserved for init, and then you'll see a lot of parent process IDs referred to as 1 if it's kind of something that was started by init. Then run level programs are executed from the etc rc.d, rc*.d directory. So run level, we're getting things up and running. Not too bad, a lot similar, a lot easier to digest than the Windows boot process. Some of the terminology overlaps. We had BIOS and MBR. Booting up operating systems, very similar to Windows. All right, this slide here, I think these, as far as my experience goes, this will cover 99% of what you're trying to do in Linux. And if you kind of understand these commands, know how to use them, gain, like a 7 out of 10 confidence that you can execute any of these commands and work with them, that's going to go so far for your career. And a lot of tools that are out there, especially in the cybersecurity space, you're going to have to master the Linux command line and be very comfortable navigating the CLI. It's definitely a skill that employers like to see. And if you're just someone who's lost in the sauce for the CLI, please spend 1 week just going over these commands, getting familiar with some of their switch options. We can call out a few here to definitely be familiar with. grep, grabbing values on our strings, listing the processes, listing the stuff in the directory, making a file, making a directory, passwd, your text editors, VI and Nano, catting out a file if you want to read it, find for finding files or string values, appending versus overriding, killing processes either by specific PID or by anything by name. We're going to cover these a little bit later. Removing something, removing directories. We've worked with our tarball files before and files that have been zipped up or uncompressing a zipped file. Scheduling tasks. The pipe command is basically saying execute this part of the command line before executing the second part. So you can merge commands together and you separate that with a pipe. Chmod, we covered UGO for user group and ownership, changing file permissions, adding users, deleting users, starting and stopping services. Sudo, we're going to cover that in the next slide. Switch user, SSH, also going to cover special callouts there. IP address information, who am I on the system? Definitely, I would say I'm pretty confident knowing these, being familiar with them, how to use them, it'll take you very far. So I just want to kind of condense at least one slide for you for all of the overwhelming amount of Linux commands that are out there, give you a better idea of which ones to focus on. And I feel like these will go the farthest for you in your career, kind of, bang for buck for investment time, for return on value for your time spent. Special callouts from that command slide before: sudo, super user, do. So you're switching to a user who has elevated privileges. It's usually going to be the root user without actually having to log in as root. So if I'm in my shell as Haley and I need to execute a command, but it requires elevated privileges and I'm just a regular user on the machine, I can put in sudo before my command and then execute it, and it will execute as root and allow me to complete the command. su dash, this is switch user dash, and it allows you to switch to a different user account and assume the identity of the root user. So unlike sudo, su dash requires the user to enter the password of the target user or root user. So if you just want to switch into root, you just do su dash and then enter the credentials and you become root. You can do, Amanda, switch user into Amanda, enter Amanda's credentials, and now you'll execute as Amanda. So you can switch back into yourself or your current role or another role, or if you just do su dash, you'll go into root. And then SSH, we've covered this as well as the introduction to Nix module. It's going to be TCP port 22, and it's a protocol used to securely connect to a remote machine over the network. It allows users to log in to a remote machine, execute commands, access files, as if you were working directly on the remote machine. You're definitely going to SSH into a bunch of machines throughout your command. Kind of how I break it up in my mind, we have Linux and Windows. Linux, we're generally going to use SSH, and Windows, Telnet. Again, secure, everything's encrypted, clear text, not the best. Since we had the special call out for SSH suite, we definitely want to be familiar with a couple of other things that start with S, like SFTP and STP. So I'm sure you've probably heard of these, but again, SSH, suite of software that contains programs to allow secure, encrypted channel of communication between devices. And maybe the new command series to definitely be familiar with is Secure File Transfer Protocol. So it's like regular FTP that we've talked about to transfer files over the network, but now we're doing it in a secure, encrypted fashion, leveraging the SSH suite. And then secure copy, same exact thing, copy files over the network. So what is the difference? These sound very similar to each other. So I made this little blurb here for you. Secure File Transfer Protocol, it's similar to secure copy, but secure copy is going to be faster because SFTP is going to use packet acknowledgement. So remember when we talked about our TCP flags? We talked about the three-way handshake. I think that's the only introduction we've made to TCP flags. We had that communication for SYN, SYNAC, and ACK. SYNAC and ACK. These were our TCP flag set, and the acknowledgement was basically saying, yes, I have acknowledged that I've wanted to initiate the communication with you. I'm acknowledging that I got your packet. So because that's taking up more bytes, literally, in the packet that's being sent over, and it's waiting for the acknowledgement and has those checks and bounds in place with the TCP flags, it's going to be slower. So SCP does not use acknowledgement flags, and SFTP does. So that's kind of like the main difference between them. Here we have some examples of SSH. If I wanted to SSH into my user on this Linux server, I would just do Haley @ and then the name of the host machine that I want to SSH into, enter my credentials, and I authenticate to the remote machine. Another example, I want to SSH to the user admin at this host IP, process is the same. SCP, I want to secure copy files over the network, so I can do SCP student at the Linux host. And if we have kind of highlighting here the difference between remote to local and local to host, if we have file.txt here, it's basically saying I want to copy file.txt from the remote host to my local host into my home.student directory on the local host. Going the other way, if I wanted to copy file.txt from my local host, I kind of put it in the front part of the command, and I say I want to put it on student at Linux host in the remote host home student directory. So this is remote. So this is going from remote to local, and this is going from local to the remote host. So kind of remember it as wherever the colon is broken out, that's where you're grabbing or putting something on the remote host. So since file.txt came after the colon for the host that we're SCPing to, that means I'm grabbing it from the remote host to then put on the local host. If I give the local host a directory for where I want to put something, and I have the file over on the left-hand side, that means I'm going from local and I want to put it on the remote host at this remote host directory. I probably should have picked two different directories here, but in hindsight, I think the point still is clear. Just wanted to give you some examples of how the commands are used and how you might see them. And then an example of secure file transfer protocol. Going to Haley at my Ubuntu host. I'm going to enter my credentials, and then I'll have a SFTP prompt displayed to me. So at a high level, I would understand the SSH suite, and they can offer SFTP and SCP, and maybe be aware of some of the commands and how you would use them or how you would SSH to a remote host. That's all. Pretty digestible, I think.